So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ACDH-CH lecture 8.4, where our guest today is Anne Luther, and we welcome also students from the University of Continuous Education here. And to start, I would like to pass on the word to the director of the ACDH-CH, Dr. Alexandra Lenz, who will tell you a little bit more about our guest today.
Okay, welcome everybody, and especially a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Anne Luther. I'm going to introduce her to you. Well, Anne Luther is a specialist for digital heritage and a digital humanities scholar in general. Her work applies technology design and humanities research for the interaction, exploration, and opening of cultural heritage preserved and represented in digital data. That's also the topic of today's talk. Anne is the founder of the Institute for Digital Heritage and principal investigator for Digital Benin, leading the development of a digital platform which brings together rich documentation from collections worldwide to provide a long requested overview of the royal artworks looted in the 19th century from the Kingdom of Benin. And Luther holds a PhD from Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design in London, where she developed a pioneering interactive data visualization software for qualitative research. Between 13 and 15 of this century, she brought a research focus in data-driven humanities research to the Parsons Institute for Information Mapping. And between 15 and 18, she established an emphasis on the analysis of museum data, leading data sprints, workshops, international research collaborations, and software development as research coordinator at the Center for Data Arts at Parsons School of Design in New York. And Luther was selected as an expert on digitization strategies, and digital collection management for the Museums Lab, a platform for joint learning, exchange, and continuing education regarding the future of museums in Africa and Germany, financed by the German Federal Foreign Office in close cooperation with the African consultancy group, the Advisors. She was invited to present and consult on digital strategies in museums, on team management in digital projects, and data-driven research by the German Federal Cultural Foundation, the German Museum Federation, and Rust Lab at Ruhr-University Bochum in the Ruhrpott, among others. We are very pleased and happy to have her here. And yeah, we are looking forward to a talk on contextualizing museum data. Anne Luther, it's your stage.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. I'm really excited to be in Vienna for the first time during this very special time with a little bit of snow during the holiday season. So thank you very much for having me here, and hello to our online viewers as well. I'm excited to present to you for the next sort of 45 minutes or so a brief overview of data in the museum context, or rather sort of what digital information, digital materials in museums are. And I will also introduce you to a current project that I launched about 3 weeks ago with my colleagues, with my international team, called Digital Benin. And the short introduction will give you a good idea about the sort of broader context of this project, but also where the information that we gathered is coming from. And because we only have an hour or so for all of this, and I'm really interested to hear your questions and comments, and maybe we have a discussion afterwards, I'm going to leave you my contact information here. So if our lively discussion wants to continue in the virtual or in the real world, you have my contact information here. So to understand current digital heritage, specifically in museums, we need to look at the history of digitization in the museum context. And I want to start this presentation by giving you an understanding of what digitization means in the museum context, because we are currently at a state where we can build augmented reality engagement in institutions, virtual exhibitions for interactions that user can view at home. But when did this engagement start, and how can we contextualize data and digital content that is used for exactly these engagements that we're building at the moment in VR and so on. So we are going to look at a little bit of a very short history. So the digitization of cultural collections can be dated back to projects such as Corpus Thomisticum by Robert Buza S.J. and Associates, initiated in 1949 in cooperation with IBM, digitizing the complete works of St. Thomas Aquinas. The discourse on digitization in museums started in the early 1970s. And the British Museum, for example, digitized their collection records. They began in 1979. I want to read you a quote from Robert Shanhal and Peter Homelos that they wrote in 1978. I quote, "Very few museums have ever had completely adequate records of the objects in their collections. Most try to maintain some account of new accessions, either in bound ledgers or in cards. And individual curators often keep files that are more or less for their own research, if used in conjunction with good memory. But except for the records necessary to provide legal accountability, most collection documentation can be said to be non-systematic." And that was in 1978. So historically, information about objects was stored in physical ledgers, on cards, in inventory books, on files with photographs, letters, sales receipts, exhibition materials, and more. And in the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, large digitization projects started to systematically document these information with computer technology, meaning that this material was transcribed or scanned or photographed. And consequently, these materials were stored in databases following a systematic logic on conceptualizing database standards or data formatting. As early as 1969, a consortium of 25 US art museums called the Museum Computer Network and its commercial partner IBM declared, "We must create a single information system which embraces all museum holdings in the United States." Approaches of standardization for metadata and vocabularies was first introduced in 1969 with the intention to make data shareable, transferable, linkable, and grant easy access and retrievable information across museum databases. However, since the beginning of digitization, museums also followed their own individual logic for cataloging information, and consequently many data authorities were produced. So what you just saw on the slide before, some museums were transcribing their own logic of the catalog cards, for example, that they had in their museum sort of analog databases. Some museums then tried to match it into a system so the data can be into a sort of standardized metadata framework so that the data can be shareable. However, this sort of first logic of storing information in the way that your own institution would like to store or, let's say, collect information about their objects became the standard. And so, you know, as other scholars, like, for example, Hannah Turner in her book Cataloging Culture, or Matthew Lincoln has also published about this. I quote him, there are several relevant authorities out there, for example, FIAF, logs, subject headings, DPpedia, geonames, not to mention the Gettys, AAT, ULAN, and TNG. The British Museum links to none of them. They already have their own internal thesaurus of people and materials and subjects, and to map those to existing authorities would be a monumental task. Matthew Lincoln wrote this in 2016. So I will show you in the following in a bit more detail why this is relevant and what that means for digital heritage projects, but also for data realities in the museum context internationally. Digitization of data in museums has a long-standing history, and since its beginning, museum staff were interested in reflecting on the data that is produced by their institutions and by museums, to use data in their own research on objects and to communicate data to an interested audience and to connect data to information outside of the museum's collection. To summarize, digitization is the process of converting information into a digital format and to create digital documentation or also digitally born information. So in the context of museum collection, that means that information that were historically stored and collected prior to working with the computer on catalog cards or curator nodes were being converted into a digital format such as structured data, digital photographs or scans, sounds, and other digital documentation. It also means that today, information that is created in digital formats is also stored in databases. So digital material is stored in databases that traditionally resembled the information that one could find in index cards, which has gradually changed over time. And today's databases are developed according to, for example, digitally born information, relationships between this information, and is also very strongly connected to temporary interests or even technologies that the museums are using to document their objects, or also sort of referring to the needs of their own institution. So the sort of development from resembling the catalog cards, you can still sort of see this in some of the data that museums are collected, but the shift is, of course, that we can now see that there is a sort of local data, that the data is locally implemented into or related to the needs of the museum. The way that institutions therefore store their information also reflects the way, on the way that an object is described, viewed, or communicated. So when the historic information changes on the objects, the knowledge and interest about an object is also set within the context of the change in an institution. It also gives a clear idea about the technology that is used when, for example, scanning objects or creating 3D models or photogrammetry using X-ray technology for restoration, exhibition, and research. So what I really want to sort of strengthen with this argumentation or with this sort of gradual change of digital information in institutions, what I really want to make clear is that when the let's say, collection of an institution changes, that can also be reflected in data. Or if, for example, the needs or the research or the exhibitions in institutions also sort of go with time, that is also, or that can also be reflected in the data that the museums are storing about their objects. So when I'm talking about digital material or data in museums, I need to sort of maybe clarify what I mean with data or even metadata. And I really recommend, if you start any digital project, to clarify terms like data, metadata, digital material, objects, what is an object, what is a code, when you start to work with people from, let's say, more of a programming background, when you're the person in the humanities, because as we all know, sometimes these terms are a little ambiguous, and they need to be sort of clarified or communicated within a team before you start any project. So that is what I want to do with you now. And I'm using a definition by Christine Borgemann for the term data, for this very ambiguous term data, which could be a lecture in and of itself. But Christine Borgemann writes, in addition to digital manifestations, it refers to forms that generally require the assistance of computational machinery and software in order to be useful, either generated or compiled by humans or machines. And this is a definition, of course, of digital data. An example for this abstract definition in the museum context could be an object which can be described as data or display data, especially when it comes to digitally born objects. Here, on this slide, however, is an example that defines the object as the material that data is collected about. So this is something that you typically find in an online catalog. Data formats that commonly are produced in museums are audio, images, text, video, and web formats as information and documentation or data values about the objects in their collections. Here is a list of data formats that museums produce most commonly, and these are usually stored in a database that internal staff has access to. So these, of course, are not all data formats or even data. I just want to give you an example as an introduction to clarify the terms data and metadata and data formats. So let us now take a look at what databases are typically used for in the museum context. Databases in museums vary from institution to institution or even between departments in some institutions. So some institutions, so some museums, have multiple databases depending on your department. Sometimes these databases can communicate to each other, sometimes they use different standards. Databases are not only places to store information about objects, as you saw on the slide before, but also about operations in the museum related to an object such as storage, restoration, loans, or information about images and other information that are relevant for staff in the museum. So also depending not only on your subject sort of department, but also on, let's say, the restoration department or the image department might have a different database or a different database access in a museum institution. And sometimes they are connected, sometimes they are not. So databases can be powerful tools when used in a way that allows the machine to interact and retrieve data in human interaction. It is not possible for most databases to retrieve data in natural language processes, and therefore it is important to understand limitations and possibilities of human-machine interaction for the best results in data retrieval and information storage. That means, in clear words, that more care an institution has for data production, and the clearer it is for staff how computers interact with human-made information, the better a database will work as an information tool. And generally, databases have the following functions. Databases have the purpose to document collections. So, for example, to document object materials, dates, the creators of objects. You can manage collections, of course, with this, the use, the rights, the location control. Excuse me. Let me try again. Resource discovery. And of course, preservation. So preservation not only of the sort of research that institutions are producing about their objects, but also, for example, about the life of the object in the institution. So who has worked on the object while the object was part of the institution's collection or exhibitions, let's say. I want to point out the Wikipedia article here on collections management systems, which is a great resource, which is always updated by researchers in the GLAM world or by practitioners from the museum side. This is a really great source for an overview of what databases should want to do in the museum context. So I want to summarize as time is running. Data in the museum context is information to describe, document, and preserve information about an object, digital material or immaterial, and the life of this object in and outside of the museum. And metadata is the category or field that this information is stored under. It gives the user of a database information about the values that are stored in the database. Information that have a common set of metadata fields are stored in a database. Databases in museums vary in data and metadata standards depending on the needs of the institution. And here is a slide of the most common standard resources, data standard resources, and also the most common database software is currently available. What that means is that also as I said, the metadata standards are different depending on the institutions. The data standards that are referenced in some of the databases in museums are also varying from institution to institution. The softwares that they are using are also different differing depending on the institution. And also sometimes standards are referenced and sometimes they are not. Sometimes the institution has their own thesaurus or data standards, and sometimes institutions have their own developed database that they are using internally. And also the sort of export possibilities then vary from institution to institution, but also from department to department, depending on the institution. So the data that are published online are just a part of the internal databases that museums are using, and formats for publication also differ on the copyright policies of the museums. At the moment, we have two main approaches in the field of digital infrastructure that work with this reality that I'm describing on the goal to connect museum data between institutions. One is the linked open data movement, and the other is a standardization of data in one national or regional database, such as Europeana for Europe, Art UK for the UK, Video Museum for France, and other projects. In my view, the issue with linked open data is that objects are shown under an open license, CC0 license, and not all museums can comply with this. And a discussion about who owns what information about which objects is a huge portion of publishing data. And also the discussion on digital restitution and, of course, authorship, who writes what about objects in museums is part of the discourse on publishing data under what kind of license. The issue with standardization of museum data is that the local knowledge that a museum has built, even in the data structure that they use in their institutions, is lost. So what I was describing earlier, the need of an institution, the technology that they are using, the way that they are, for example, describing the object, all of that, if you're standardizing to use only, let's say, fields that are used under a certain standard, all of that sort of local knowledge is lost. And so with my current project, Digital Benin, we worked with a diverse data reality that I just introduced to you, and build an approach that nevertheless made it possible to connect the data and build an online database that is contextualized in a knowledge forum that prioritizes the knowledge production about objects from the perspective of the community that these objects belong to, and these objects were from. So I really want to take the sort of last 30 minutes or the next 30 minutes to introduce you to this approach to connect museum data in that sort of or from institutions that used a lot of different standards, and also introduce you just to this project. But before I do, go and show you the website that we've built, the knowledge forum that we've built, I want to sort of give you a little bit of background about the project. So Digital Benin started in 2020, just before the pandemic, in the sort of while we were all grasping the sort of digital communication as well amongst each other. But the first phase when we started was, of course, to ask museums about their data. What kind of data have they stored about their objects in their local databases, in their internal databases? We then started to process the data and to sort of research the data. What kind of information can we find in the data that was transferred to us? In the phase 2, we built prototypes for linking the data. We brought in our history and also research on the objects. And in the third phase, we designed an interface and tested the functions that we've built, and then we published the database. So this is all very abstract. And I'm coming to the content. I just want to stay in the data realm a little bit more. Our team built 12 internal software tools for our team to research the data instantly and also to link the data. And these tools that we've built and the sort of strategy that we've built, but also the workflows that we've developed, that is all transferable. So we have built a model not only to work with museum data for this one project, but also for museum data in general, because over 400 data sets were sent to us from 131 institutions in 20 countries. And so we compared the 400 data sets with different data structures, languages, data standards with each other. Also, we received any data format that you can imagine, from, let's say, JSON to CSV, but also PDFs, emails, Word documents that were sent to us, because some of the even really established museum databases only allow a Word document as a data export. And so the way that we have linked the metadata, only the metadata structure, for example, was to compare the field titles, the fields, the metadata descriptors with each other. And we then formed a sort of metadata translator of fields that showed similarity. So, and I will show you how that looks in the project. So from that sort of comparison, we developed 38 fields that were comparable in most of these data sets. And the museums transmitted between 4 fields, so really just the sort of material, measurements, title, and I don't know, another field, and 191 data fields. So really describing everything that you can imagine, but also sometimes a lot of image fields were a part of these, a lot of these data fields. So I want to say between 40 or 30 and 40 was were the sort of number of fields that were transferred to us most of the time. We received 12,527 images for 5,200 objects. And so from this, we developed this sort of schema that we asked the museums to send us their data in the way that they have stored it in their internal databases. So, and with that, we asked the museums we met the data from the museums where it's at. So the way that the museums are describing their objects in their internal databases. We then built the metadata translator or connection layer. And from that, we brought in, of course, our own research and oral history and more to build the digital knowledge forum. And I want to show this to you now so it's not so abstract anymore. So in 2020, we started with our project team, 5 principal investigators that have been working in the field of the Benin objects for a long time. Jonathan Fine, Barbara Plankensteiner, and Konkungwe Gafona are specialists on the object. Felicity Bodenstein is a provenance researcher and a lecturer at the Sorbonne. And I came in, my role in the project was to be the catalyst between the research side and the technology and design side. So my expertise was on building software and digital platforms based in the context of museum data, and of course to bring also new research to the platform. We hired researchers for the contextualization of objects, but also from Godfrey Akator is the research lead in Benin City in Nigeria. Elagoso Bubaifo is a researcher and anthropologist in Benin City. Mabel Oviahan was a research assistant in Benin City who were working on the history of these objects that we looked at, and also on the local knowledges and embeddedness and use of these objects in their community. Emeline Delacroix is a provenance researcher, and Imogen Carlson is an object specialist. Our development and design team, Christelle Dennis and Alex Horak were building the platform on the back end and the front end. Gwendolyn Tiedemann was working with us as a data steward, so to process the data so that we can instantly use it and the data that was transferred to us. And Osaze Amadazun is a designer who worked with us on the visual language of the platform and the front-end design. And we also worked with consultants in several contexts, so in Benin City on language, but also on history, and Chao Tayana as a consultant on language and content that we display on the platform. So Digital Benin as a project brings together all object, historical photographs, and rich documentation material from collections worldwide to provide a long-requested overview of the royal artifacts from the Benin Kingdom looted in the late 19th century. And the historic Benin objects are an expression of Benin arts and culture and history, and were originally used as royal representational arts to depict historical events, to communicate and to worship and perform rituals. So Digital Benin, after the 2 years now, connects data from 5,246 objects across 131 institutions in 20 countries. And I want to show you now the spaces that we have built to show exactly the data and information that we have received from these 131 institutions in a sort of context that we've built on Digital Benin. So first I want to start with a catalog, which is one of the central tools in Digital Benin. So this metadata structure that I have so abstractly described, you can find it here in the all fields filter. So we have found these sort of metadata fields that you can compare in most of the data sets about object information. We have also found metadata or data about object production, the provenance, the object context, and institutional contexts. So, for example, which department in the institution holds the object, just one example. As I have described before, we are showing the data as the museums have stored it in their databases, which you can see here. For example, the Staatliche Ethnographische Sammlung Sachsen und Staatliche Kultursammlung Dresden uses this data structure and, of course, language. And on the right-hand side, you can see, for example, that the Objekte _ID is connected to the metadata field object ID. We show the images on the right-hand side in the quality that makes it possible to zoom into the images. I want to show you one example of a museum that is also showing, for example, an image on just as a sort of documentation, but we also brought in 3D models where we had them. So our users can also sort of view the objects in multiple perspectives and in more detail as an image could show. We did not digitize any data, so all of the data that you see here is coming from the institutions, except for the Lagos Museum and the museum in Benin City. They had analog databases, and so our researchers transcribed catalog cards that they sorted out of the analog database that these institutions have. So they went through thousands of catalog cards to identify the objects that are relevant for this project and then transcribed them, and then we also brought them into our catalog. One aspect that we found, for example, was that the museums are often not describing the objects in the language of the community. So most of the institutions that we have in the catalog use English as the language that they also used in their internal databases. And for example, Edo designations. So the way that you would describe an object in Edo, which is the language of the community in Benin City, and the Edo state is basically was non-existent in most of the data that was transferred to us. And so our researcher, Elegosa Obobaifo, worked collaboratively, of course, with the team to bring in a space, Eoto, which is a foundational space which shows the Edo language of these objects. The descriptions of each object group that is coming together here also contextualizes the objects in the use and function within the community. And we also brought in spoken language. So our users can learn to pronounce these objects also in Edo language. These Edo designations, it was a really intense research in Benin City because most of the Edo designations, some of course are known, but most of them were lost in the 125 years after the loot. And so Elegosa Obobaifo spoke to producers in Benin City that are still producing some of the objects in guilds. She collaborated with local historians, with linguistic professors from the University of Benin. And so that research, and of course consulted with her team member, Imogen Coulson, on literature that was already written about these objects. And so what we have here is now also a filter that allows our users to see, for example, all of the relief plugs in the catalog together for the first time. So all of the, for example, plugs that we found in 72 institutions, we can now see in this catalog together, because the controlled vocabulary in the Edo language then became the connector between these data sets based on the English designation or Edo designation relief plug. These are not really one-to-one translations. Some, for example, English designations exist, but an Edo designation doesn't exist for them, and vice versa. You can also then, here in these filters that we've used for the controlled vocabulary, of course, read about all of the research that we've brought in, and also they become links here as our DB research describes here. So this was sort of brought on into the catalog as a filter, but in Eoto it is an own space, a foundational space on the platform that is then woven into the catalog as research from the team. So this weaving, this concept of weaving between the platforms, or between the, as we call them, doors that you can see here on the first side is something that I will introduce to you gradually now also. So every content that you can see is also woven into another space on the platform. So there is not one way to understand the objects or the content, the context of the objects, but there are multiple entryways. There is a multiplicity to view the objects and the context of these objects. So here, the one last sort of information that I want to give you is the artist Osaze Amadazun made these sort of visual representation of object groups that you can find here. They were linked by their Edo designation, so we brought in written language about the function and use of the objects in their local context, in their historical context. We brought in the spoken language of the Edo designations and also a visual representation. And all of this can also be downloaded as a coloring book or as language cards for the use in, for example, educational context, but also if you just sort of want to explore the platform and the objects by doodling in a coloring book. And contemplate on the objects and sort of learn from this. You can also download the coloring book here. So the filters that I introduced are the Edo designation, the English designation. We also have categories that show you more of the context of these objects. Of course, the institutions are a filter. And now we also have provenance names as filters. And the provenance names are retrieved from the data that was sent to us by the institutions. So we didn't add our own provenance research. What we for retrieving these provenance names, what that means is that, for example, William Downing Webster in the Field Museum is spelled W.D. Webster. We have connected this to the provenance name William Downing Webster, so that all spellings of that we can find in the data is connected to a controlled vocabulary. So that makes it filterable again. Some of the provenance names that we have brought in here also show links to, for example, websites outside of or external to Digital Benin, but also a biography. And we also connected the provenance names to roles, so you can filter, for example, and see all of the dealers that have dealt with or that were found as provenance names in the data that the museums have transferred to us. That might be, for example, interesting to provenance researchers. You can, for example, also see members of the British colonial military campaign on Benin as tagged here. So this is research that we brought, with which we enriched the data of the institutions. The institutions can, of course, also be filtered by country. So if you are, for example, interested in understanding which Austrian institutions have objects in their collections, you can find the institutions' pages here, which shows, of course, the websites, the online catalog, but also the licenses and ownership of the digital material, specifically for images most of the time. Because Digital Benin does not own this data, and we asked museums to send us the data, of course, in their licenses, because most of the institutions would not have been able to transfer data to us if we had asked them for an open license. I want to from sort of this, from the institutions, show you the connection to a map that we've developed. So we show a map of the ancient Benin Kingdom, or Edo South, in contemporary Edo State and Benin City here. And we, for example, show you locations and also descriptions of places that contextualize some of the locations where historic objects might have been located before the loot. And here, for example, if you are interested to learn about the Queen Mother altar in the context of the objects that show the Queen Mother, you now have sort of an overview of the context, of the local context of altars and shrines that are also described here on the platform. And next to it, you can see where these objects are located today. And of course, here we also show the online catalog again. Well, you can see where it is located exactly on the map. And then from here, you can also come back to the institution's page, which then shows you, again, the Eoto space with the Edo designations, and also, for example, the provenance names that we have connected. And from here, you can come to the provenance space for example, the provenances that we have connected here. From here, you can come back to, of course, the map where these objects are located. So everything that we show here is woven together. One aspect, of course, was that we have the information that the institutions have collected, but then there is information about the objects that a local community in Benin City holds. And so our researcher, our research lead, Godfrey Ekator, interviewed members of people in Benin City, Edo people in Benin City, about historical figures, for example, about a guild context, so how were these objects made. So you can view, for example, how objects here, for example.
Okay, so now you have covered the design. So what are you about to do now?
I'm about to fix the passage yes, the brush to run through into the work. This is how we do it. These are wax products, beeswax. We fix like this, and we stick them again together with fire.
So we're here actually in the artist studio, so to say, or in the guild, in the production of a guild member, Phil Omondanwen, in Benin City. And with these videos that you can see here, you are introduced to bronze casting and to the lost beeswax method, for example. But we also have other contexts. For example, we're showing a context of a ritual. We're hearing about, the sort of sacrificial gourd and what the meaning of some of the iconography, for example, in some of the objects are. And then these are then again connected to the Eoto space by connecting them to the videos here. So you can view also some of the objects that are mentioned in those videos. A last space that I want to introduce to you is the Iton Edo, which shows you, or which gives you our users a perspective or a place to learn about the hierarchies, for example, and the socioeconomic backgrounds and the historical context of these objects and where they are from or where they were located prior to being in the museum collections now. So for example, we see in the local government areas, you can see that the Oba Palace is located in the Benin City metropolitan area in Oredo, which is a local government area. Here you can read, of course, about the Oba Palace. You can also understand which palace societies are structured under the Oba Palace and which chieftaincy titles are affiliated with what types of palace societies and so on. And so these texts here are also, as you can see, referenced. And in Itornado, Godfrey Akator has referenced only Edo scholars, so scholars that are not necessarily from a European or US American context who have written mostly about these objects, but scholars, Edo scholars, that brought in knowledge for the construction of this space. So these are all of the doors that we have created in Digital Benin and that you can explore, sort of in connection to the museum data, but also to the research that we brought onto Digital Benin. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.